In this episode of the Nova Lore series, I'm going to give an abridged historical timeline of the major events that took place leading up to the game Nova. Keep in mind there's a whole lot more that's happening both during and between the events I'm going to talk about, but this timeline should hopefully give the basics of how the setting came to be. Okay, let's talk about how the sun dies. About 300 years before the Nova event itself happened, humanity first arrives in the Oberon star system. That helps us understand that this world is not our own world. It's a world that humanity has found later on in life. And when they arrived, they chose a number of different planets and moons to begin terraforming. Oberon is one of those planets, and there are others along the way. Another notable planet that was chosen is the planet Zed. About 130 years after that, the terraforming process has been ongoing, and contact with the colony world Zed gets completely cut off. Oberon is unable to reestablish a connection of communication with Zed from that point on. At about 125 years before the Nova event itself, the terraforming efforts of Oberon are considered successful. That basically just means that there's sort of a baseline survival status that it's been established. The people on Oberon can survive, their needs have been met. This frees them up to basically start to move towards other efforts. Specifically, they start looking towards a scientific research perspective, and more importantly, trying to reconnect with the other worlds that are in the system. About 30 years after that, the first major solar flare is detected. This also coincides with a major energy spike that's emitted from the edge of the system. This is where the planet Zed is. This whole flare and energy spike thing would continue on and off for the next 80 years. That brings us to about 10 years before the Nova event itself. At that point, it's determined that the sun has grown incredibly unstable and will likely collapse way sooner than anybody could have possibly expected. There's not enough time to flee the planet. All of the ships had been dismantled in part of the terraforming process. And so, as a result, a proposal is made of building some bunkers and putting the humans who are on Oberon and the other planets in the system into a sort of stasis. 3 years before the Nova itself, the first pieces of the sun are detected as having broken off and have begun hurtling their way towards Oberon and the various moons and other colonies in the system. This brings us to the Nova event itself. At that point, the Nova event officially begins when the sun shards first begin to make contact with Oberon and its moon. This basically coincides alongside a slow eclipsing of the sun from the sky. At this point, humanity has already entered the bunkers and has begun the stasis process. They are sort of blissfully unaware of the fact that their planet above on the surface has destruction raining down on it, and most of what old Oberon used to be gets destroyed as these sun shards begin to make contact with the planet. While humanity sits in stasis, asleep and unaware of all of this, 3 years after the Nova event, the Corvus Dominion fleet first enters the Oberon solar system. The people in the bunkers are completely unaware of this, but these avian aliens have begun their work in the system. 20 years after the Nova event is when the awakening process first begins in the bunkers. The first earliest humans are sort of woken up from their stasis pods and they begin monitoring the surface. They notice that the world has been blasted, of course, as the sun shards had smashed into the world itself, and they're basically waiting for conditions to get at least somewhat safe for them to go out and begin that scouting effort. That scouting doesn't really begin for about 3 years after the awakening process. So for a long time, humanity is awake in small numbers in these bunkers, waiting and waiting. The first scouts do emerge, though, about 23 years after the Nova event, and they simply don't return. Nobody ever hears from them ever again. 5 years after that, a latent energy source is detected near a particular bunker, Bunker 312. Scouts are sent out from that bunker and they find the first sun shard. At this point, the sun shards have sort of cooled enough that they are safe to approach. And what these scouts notice is that the area immediately surrounding the sun shard hasn't been warped and twisted like the other parts of Oberon that had been scouted so far. 2 years after that, so 30 years after the Nova event, researchers in Bunker 312 have found a way to capture the power of the sun shard in a relatively safe manner. In order to do this, though, they're going to need to dismantle the bunker, scrapping it for all of its parts, essentially, and then moving up to the surface. The first sun shard is harnessed then, and humanity has access to its first sources of light, warmth, and power in decades. Effectively, humanity has created its first miniature Dyson sphere. 5 years after that, the sun shard is powering this first settlement, and it's going well, but they realize that they need more. They want to try and expand, and so more sun shards need to be found. The shard is powerful, but it's small, and so more sun shards need to be sought out across the surface of Oberyn. They learned their lessons, though, from the earlier scouts who had just went out and disappeared or had been warped horribly by their exposure to the planet's surface. And so they built exosuits that were fueled by the sun shard itself. These are sort of proto-sparks, the eventual mechs that humanity would pilot in the current setting of Nova. These proto-sparks were able to locate the largest sun shard on the entire planet of Oberyn. That sun shard would be the catalyst that would start an effort that would create a sort of network that gets developed. It's realized that they can sort of pool together tethered sun shards, and a city is built across this first web of tethered sun shards, and the city is known as Helios. It is going to ultimately become the largest and most powerful city and settlement on Oberyn. After that, after Helios sort of gets established, we're at about 40 years after the Nova event. There's a priority at this point to try and learn about the world. The protosparks had been helpful for early scouting, but now the first actual spark gets developed. And the model that's developed is the Voyager model. The Voyager gets built because of its expertise in scouting, in mapping, in stealth. Hopefully we'll be able to go out and not be noticed by any of the threats that have been sort of early detected in the dusk, as it's called. And the pilot who takes this first model is codenamed Echo. Echo would be the first person to don that suit and would also probably become one of the most famous spark pilots of all time. Alongside this, kind of coinciding with this development of Voyager, there's sort of a 50-year gap where contact with other bunkers begins. Many other bunkers are still in a sort of stasis sleep, waiting for the planet to either have become safe or for other humans to sort of wake them from that sleep. And so there's a process by which other people begin to emerge from their bunkers. New settlements are established of various sizes all across the surface based off of sort of the size of the nearest sun shard to the bunker. So while all that's going on, Voyager has been built, and 2 years after Voyager gets built, Echo has their first recorded contact with the Corvus Dominion and basically barely survives the encounter. This sort of leads to a catalyst of rapid development. There's a 5-year period where Voyager models that have been built are being harried and harassed as they move out into the dusk to explore the world. And so additional spark designs get drawn up to sort of protect these Voyagers, as well as try and take the fight back against the forces of the Dusk. The Dusk becomes this term that's used in and around Helios and other settlements to describe the entire part of the planet that is not actually within the protective warmth of a sun shard. In order to protect Voyagers, additional models of sparks are created. This is called the first wave of sparks. And so alongside Voyager would be the Pyre, Scorch, and Warden models to sort of defend Voyagers, but also go fight other enemy forces. Pretty soon after that, the timing works out nicely, the first Corvus War would break out between the avian aliens and the city of Helios, and the city barely survives that encounter as well. Right after the first war against the Corvus, also during that period of sort of re-emergence from the bunkers, while many bunkers are waking up and people are creating new settlements, there's also reports of waves of people who are abandoning these cities or flat out refuse to join them in the first place. They don't want to leave the bunkers, or they believe that linking themselves to these sun shards is not what they should be doing. These people move out to the ruins of Oberyn in the dusk, the blasted wasteland, the ruined cities of where they had once lived. in theory seeking out their old lives. Over time, however, these roaming bands would be warped and twisted by the effects of the dusk and would eventually become known as the apocalypse-seeking Hellion gangs. 100 years after the Nova event, a spark returns to the city of Eret, and the spark has been pierced with what looks to be Moonstone. The spark is malfunctioning upon its return to Eret and wipes out half the population of the city before it is stopped. This is the first public display of power of the organizations that would eventually be known as the Lunar Cults. About 120 to 125 years after the Nova event, there's another war. The Solar War breaks out between Helios and a number of the other settlements on Oberyn. Helios had attempted to just kind of keep expanding and expanding, incorporating as many sun shards into his network as possible, and many other settlements wanted to sort of break off and do things their own way and not become tethered to Helios, especially since Helios was sort of a beacon of violence, as most enemy forces would attack Helios rather than the other smaller settlements. So there was an effort to sort of break away. This results in Helios stepping back from its sort of expansion of the Sun Shard network, and it builds the Heliopause, which is a sort of massive defensive wall that surrounds the city-state. As a result, there's a number of independent cities and other factions that then firmly establish themselves across Oberyn. And because of that, these city-states have access to the sun tech, they have access to spark tech, and things like that, and it brings about a 5-year rapid development of a new wave of sparks. The second wave of spark development begins largely in many of these independent city-states, trying to push the boundaries of what the technology of the sun shards is capable of. This brings about the creation of the Drifter, Pox, Grim, and Sanguine models. These sparks broadly are considered extremely terrifying, but also extremely effective at what they do. And that brings us basically up to where the first Nova TTRPG takes place. There's a whole lot more that happened during and between these events, and there's also plenty more that happens beyond this second wave of sparks. So keep an eye out for future videos. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel, where we'll do deeper dives into these events. We'll glimpse into the future of the Nova setting, and we'll also talk about what actually happened during the Nova event itself. Until next time.